Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We are learning Mishnah Sotah, Parak Zion, Chapter 7, Mishnah Hey, Mishnah 5. Okay, Brachos Uklolis Ketzad. One of the things listed that had to be said in Lashon Kodesh in Hebrew were the blessings and the curses. The blessings and the curses, which were pronounced upon two mountains, Har Eval and Har Grizim. Now, the Mishnah now is going to go through what went on there. Until now, the Mishnayos have been talking about the source of how do we know that whether something has to be said about when the things that have to be said in the Hebrew language. Previous Mishnayos were going through that. This Mishnah does not tell us the source. We discussed yesterday the source of how we know that these blessings and curses have to be given in Lashon Kodesh, in the Holy Tongue in Hebrew. The Mishnah itself does not mention it, but the Mishnah goes through what went on there. So Mishnah's Ketzad. How were these blessings and curses said? Kevan Sha'ara Yisrael Sayarden. Once the Jewish people crossed over the Jordan River into the land of Israel. Ubo el Har Gerizim al Har Eval. And they came upon Mount Gerizim and Mount Eval, Shebeshomron, which were located in the region of Shomron, which they translate as Samaria, Shebetzat Shechem, which is next to Shechem, Shebe'ez Elonei Moira, which is the same as saying they are next to Elonei Moira. That's how to read this. That the mountains were located in the region of Samaria, next to Shechem, and Shechem is the same place as Elonei Moira, so we could say that these mountains were near Elonei Moira also. Now, how do we know that Shechem and Elonei Moira are the same place? Because that's the point right now. The point is that these mountains were in Shechem, were in the region of Shomron, next to Shechem, which is the same thing as saying next to Elonei Moira. How do you know that? Now, which is interesting is that when the Torah talks about where Har Eval and Har Grizim are located, it doesn't mention Shechem. It mentions Elonei Moira. That's what they're next to. It doesn't mention Shechem. The Mishnah tells us is that Shechem and Elonei Moira are the same place. How do we know that? Shenamar, Haloihema Be'eva HaYarden, where the Torah describes the location of Mount Gerizim, Mount Eval, it says they are on the other side of the Jordan, next to Elonei Moira. That's what the Torah says. Ulahalanu Omer, and it says in a different place in the Torah, actually back to Bereshis, talking about Avram Avinu, Ulahalanu Omer, in a different place it says, Vayavar Avram Ba'aretz, Avraham passed through the land, Ad Mekom Shechem, until the place of Shechem, Ad Elon Moira, until Elon Moira. For some reason, the Torah feels a necessity to mention both names. And where the Torah did not mention both names, such as by the location of Har Grizim and Har Eval, there the Mishnah tells us it's Shechem. And the point is, Ma Elon Moira Amar Lahalan, just that Elon Moira said by Avram, Shechem is the same place as Shechem. Af Elon Moira Merkan Shechem. So too Elon Moira mentioned regarding the location of Mount Eval, Mount Gerizim is also Shechem. So therefore, when the Torah Mishnah is telling us that when the Torah says that these mountains are near Elonei Moira, it means they're next to Shechem. Now, that's number one. That's location. Next. Shisha Shavatim Alu L'Reish HaGrizim. 6 tribes went up on Mount Gerizim. V'Shisha Shavatim Alu L'Reish Har Eval. And 6 tribes went up on Alu L'Reish Har Eval. They went up to the top of Mount Eval. Okay, 6 tribes on the top of Mount Gerizim, 6 tribes on the top of Mount Eval. Lost the place. Hold on. 6 tribes went up to the top of Mount Gerizim. The Shisha Shvatim Al Reish Har Eval, and 6 tribes went up to the top of Mount Eval. The Kohanim, the Levites, the Leviim, and the Ark, are standing below in the middle. She got that? You have 6 tribes on Mount Gerizim. You got 6 tribes on Mount Eval, and you have in the middle the Leviim, the Kohanim, and the Aron. So let me ask you a question. If there are 6 tribes on each mountain, right, that means the tribe of Levi had to be on one of those mountains. And actually, the Bartanura tells us, who tells it? Where is it? Oh, here it is. The tribes that went up Mount Gerizim were Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Yosef, and Binyamin. The tribes that went up Mount Ava were Ruvain, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. So the tribe of Levi was already up on a mountain. And then it says the Leviim were below. So where were they? On the mountain or below? The answer is only the elders of the Kohanim and Leviim stood between the mountains. The rest of the tribe of Levi stood on the Mount Gerizim, as stated in the previous, as we just said. So that's the answer to that. Okay, so far, so now we continue. Regarding what we just said, that the Kohanim, the Leviim, the Ark are below, the Mishnah describes how they were standing. The Kohanim surrounded the Ark. Leviim surrounded the Kohanim. And the Jewish people are on each side, meaning on each side on the mountain. Shenamar, how do we know this? Because the pasuk states, again, describing, now at this point, this pasuk actually, you see the Torah tells, we have in the Torah, in the Barim, in Parashas Kisavai, I think it's Kisavai, that the Torah tells us, this is what you need to do. You need to go on Mount Gerizim, you need to go on Mount Eval, and this is and that's where you're going to say the blessing and the curses. The book of Yoshua, the book of Joshua describes when they actually did it, when they actually crossed the river and were by Har Eval and Har Gerizim. So there it says, Shenamar, as it says, V'chol Yisrael is a kainav, v'shaytrim v'shaytim aimim mizal la'arin. All of Israel and its elders and officers and judges stood on each side of the Aron. Now, what that means is that that opposite the Kohanim, the Leviim, there is the Ark of the Covenant of Hashem. Meaning, when it says, and all of Israel and its elders and officers and judges stood on this side and that side of the Ark, which is what we bring down, that means they were standing on each side of the Ark because you had tribes on Mount Gerizim and tribes on Mount Eval, and that was the Mishnah doesn't bring down the rest of the pasuk, but the Mishnah brings down opposite the Kohanim, the Leviim, the bearers of the Ark of the Covenant of Hashem. So that's how we know that you had tribes on each mountain, and then you had Kohanim and Leviim in the middle. All right, the process continues. Havchu Feneim Klape Har Gerizim. They, meaning the Kohanim and the Leviim, who stood in between the mountains, turned their faces, meaning turned their direction towards Mount Gerizim, Ufaschu Bebracha. And they said, the blessing. Which blessing? Baruch ha'ish, blessed is the man, asher lo yaseh fesel l'masecha, who does not make an engraved or metal image. Ve'elu, and these, meaning the tribes on each mountain, einim amen, respond amen. Now, if you look in the Chumash only brings down, let me finish up, let me continue. So you're ready? So you had the Leviim turning towards Har Gerizim, and they said a blessing. Then, after everybody responded, Amen, they then turned their faces towards Mount Eval, and they recited the first curse, which is, Cursed be the man who makes an engraved or metal image. And both respond, Amen, until they go through all the blessings and the curses. Now, the Torah in Parashas Kisavai lists these curses. The only thing the Torah mentions are the curses. It doesn't mention the blessings. But because we know there were blessings and curses, we know that the opposite of the curses mentioned in the Torah were the blessing. Mm-hmm. And what happened, and you had the Leviim and the Kohanim facing Mount Gerizim when they said the blessing, and that's how they started. Even though they were facing to only one mountain, the people on both mountains answered Amen, because everybody's answering to the bracha. And then they would turn their faces towards Har Eval for the curses, which was the opposite of the blessing, which is what the Torah lists. And everyone again on each mountain would answer Amen, and this was the process turning back and forth until they finished all the blessings and the curses. V'achar kach, now what was the conclusion of this? V'achar kach haviu es avonim. Afterwards, they brought the stones, ubanu es hamizbeach, and they built the altar, the Sadu Basid, and they lined it with plaster. Now, what is this referring to? What this is referring to is that the Torah says that the Torah tells us that earlier that day, meaning that day that they crossed over the yard in the Jordan River, the Jews had taken 12 large stones from the riverbed, which is what the book of Joshua records, and carry them to Mount Gerizim and Mount Aval. Now, what do they do with those stones? So the Mishnah says, after this, meaning after saying the blessings and the curses, they brought the stones that they took from the riverbed. They built a mizbeach, an altar. Okay, they built an altar. Okay, now, that is, as they say in the notes, that is the altar that the Torah had commanded them to build. Meaning in the Chumash, it already says to do this, to take the stones and build the altar. The Chumash says it. Here, where you're reading, we're talking about how, as described in the book of Yeshua, how, that they went and they did this. After saying the blessing and the curses, they went ahead and they brought the stones. They built an altar. Doesn't mention they brought sacrifices, but they did. And then it says, V'sadu basid, and they went then afterwards and they coated it with plaster. V'kasvu alav eskol divrei ha'Torah b'shivim lashon. And then on those stones they wrote the entire Torah in 70 languages. That's a lot to write on these stones, don't you think? So they bring that over here. Miraculously, they were able to write the entire Torah in 70 languages in a single day. And were able to fit it on just 12 stones. Now, by writing the Torah in the 70 languages of the 70 nations of the world, they made it possible for every nation to study Torah. Also, no nation could claim that the Torah was hidden from them. Meaning, right now, the purpose, the purpose of taking these stones and writing the Torah on it in 70 languages was to give all the nations of the world a last chance, so to speak, to study the Torah. Now, how do we know it was done in 70 languages? Shenemar ba'er heitev. Because when the Torah says, they bring down the whole pasuk here in English. As it is said, and again, talking about these stones that you're going to take and make into an altar, you shall write all the words of this Torah on the stones. Ba'er heitev, explained well. Explained well means in a way that all people of the world could understand. So that's what they did. And then, after writing it, the nutlo es ha'avanim, they then took the stones, which means they then after they bring down here, after bringing the sacrifices on the altar, they took the stones, which means they dismantled the altar, and went and spent they took the stones, and went and spent the night in their place. Where was that place that they spent the night? It was not in Shechem. Rather, that is, they traveled to a place called Gilgal and spent the night there. And they erected the stones again in Gilgal and left them there as a monument. So it started that they took the stones from the riverbed of the Jordan, they made it into an altar, they coated it with plaster, they wrote the entire Torah in 70 languages on these 12 stones, they offered sacrifices on it, they took apart the altar, they took the stones with them to where they slept that night, which was Gilgal, and that's where they left the stones as a monument. Have a wonderful day.
Okay, question, because I didn't understand some of it. They write the whole